Hello, in today's video I'm going to be analysing the UCLA Hollywood Diversity Report 2021, taking a look at the top 200 films of 2020 and how diverse they were. In this video we'll be looking at writers, directors, box office and household ratings. Of course, 2020 had the pandemic, so household ratings were taken into account for this report. This video is a second of two videos. In the first video, I was taking a look at the diversity of lead actors and the overall cast diversity, so make sure you check that video out as well. But without further ado, let's jump into this video. Welcome to Hakuna MaChatter, your place for everything positive in diversity and representation in film and TV. If you're new here to the channel, my name is Elliot. Please consider subscribing, turning on the bell notification. Now we're moving into directors and writers, and I mean, you can probably just see that first line there. Though people of colour and women made considerable progress among the ranks of film directors since the last report, they continue to face a much tougher time landing these critical behind the camera positions. And here's the thing, like, that's where we need it, man. Behind the camera representation. That is where the biggest uptake still needs to be made. And let's not waste any time. Let's just get into the numbers here so y'all can see that. So here, firstly, minoritized race directors not making that proportionate representation. So let's have a look here. In 2020, 25.4% of the directors for the year's top films were people of colour, an 11 percentage point increase from 2019. However, this is the telling part for me. So you know how I say, like, we always kind of find the moments where we can see that the increase has been really good, but then there are moments when it just kind of brings us back down to earth a little bit. So in 2011, their percentage was 12.2%, right? So it's doubled in a decade. Yeah, it's near enough doubled in a decade. However, for it to reach proportionate representation, it still has to climb 15%. So it has to exceed what it's done in a decade to reach proportionate representation. Ooh. It's moments like that where you sit down and you go, there's still a lot of work to do. And look at white directors, far exceeding, far overrepresented, you know, in comparison to the US population stats. So, and still so far underrepresented. So there's massive lack of parity there between white directors and minoritized race directors. Here you go. In 2020, only 2.5 out of 10 film directors were of a minoritized race. A lot of work to do when it comes to directors. Let's take a look at female directors. Look at this. Look at that. 78.9% are male, 20.5% are female. Don't talk to me. Don't talk to me. I mean, but like, and here's the thing, right? It's gone up fivefold in the decade, yeah? 4.1%. So, like, and especially since 2018, I mean, look at that. I mean, look at that depletion there, but look at that. That is an upward tick. That is incredible, right? Look at that work that still needs to go in. Despite these significant gains, women remained underrepresented by a factor of more than 2 to 1 in this employment arena in 2020. Only 2.1 out of 10 film directors are women. Heavily underrepresented in Hollywood as directors for the top 200 films of 2020. So let's have this breakdown by race. Again, I mean, an absolute stark underrepresentation in the breakdowns of race. Only black persons were overrepresented when it came to minoritized race. Obviously, white directors heavily overrepresented. But yeah, Latinx, Asian, mixed, MENA. Native doesn't even show up on here. Like, it's incredible. And this is the intersectionality of race and binary gender. Again, non-binary, transgender showing up here for Asian directors. But I mean, look, even in white directors, the proportionality is way off. It's not just in the minoritized races where it is way off for black, Latinx, mixed. Native doesn't even show up. Asian women are the only directors to take a small leg up over their male counterparts. The only ones. And hey, I mean, it paid off as well, because Chloe Zhao just won the freaking Oscar for Best Director, becoming the first minoritized race woman to win a Best Director Oscar. Only the second woman to win a directing Oscar in 93 years of the Oscars. What up, Hollywood? What up, the Academy? Okay, and then this is kind of interesting. I like these breakdowns as well. So what this shows is that the majority of films directed by white males in 2020 had cast that were 30% minoritized or less, and nearly 2/3 had cast that were 40% female or less. And then when you kind of look into female directors, they generally had more diverse casts, more female actors in their cast as well. And it goes the same for minoritized race directors as well. They generally hit the higher percentages here, and the same then with the intersectionality of the binary genders and race. Yeah, if it was helmed by a woman of a minoritized race, the cast had higher percentage of diverse race, of diverse casts, and higher percentage of female actors, female casts as well. It's kind of very telling. There's a very stark difference there. Oh yeah, this was a stat that's earlier up in the report, but I wrote it down later. But I'm just going to read it from a notebook. It says nearly all of the films with a female director in 2020 also featured a female lead. It was 94.7% of the female directed films had a female lead. So let's move next on to writers. Now, writers and directors, you know, it's here where we're going to see that going into then the crew and the cast, where diversity is going to expunge. It's going to expunge, is that the word I want? It's going to dilate, it's going to increase, it's going to go crazy when we have more diverse directors and writers. We've seen it there already with the director breakdowns in terms of how they were casting their films. And I think with writers, it's going to kind of go even more so in that direction, because with writers, you know, most writers will write what they know and put themselves at the center of the story. Why would you not? Of course, you're going to play to your unconscious biases, and exactly. So what we'll find is that the writers has the same kind of breakdown in terms of the more diverse the writer, the more diverse the cast. The recent progress documented in this report for women and minoritized directors is mirrored in the ranks of film writers. Women and minoritized race people made huge gains relative to their male and white counterparts among those credited for penning the top films in 2020. The gains were particularly noteworthy for writers of colour, minoritized race writers, who nearly doubled their share of these credits due to the inclusion, for the first time, of a proportionate share of black writers in 2020. Still, collectively though, they remain underrepresented. So let's take a little look. Here we go. So writers, I mean, black people were proportionally represented, but still the overall proportional representation of minoritized race people is way off. It still needs to double, near enough double, before it gets anywhere close. And again, white writers still heavily overrepresented. Let's have a look. Only 2.6 out of 10 film writers were people of a minoritized race. Yeah, this is what I like. It should be noted that more than 3/4 of the films with minority writers in 2020 also had minority directors, 81.3%. So that's near 6% over the 3/4 mark. So if you have a minoritized race writer, you're 81.3%, the chances that the director will also be of a minoritized race, and therefore then probably into the cast as well. So, and again, female writers in comparison to male writers within the binary genders, way off on that proportional representation. I mean, the increase the increase is happening over the decade, but it's taking a decade to only get halfway to proportionate representation. A decade. F off, man. Let's have a look at the breakdown when it comes to race here. So, among minoritized race people, black and multiracial people reached or exceeded proportionate representation in this employment arena in 2020, while Latinx, Asian, MENA, and Native persons remained underrepresented. And again, let's note that white writers are heavily overrepresented again as well. Let's have a look at the intersectionality. Yeah, very much the same as the directors here. Very much the same. Like every bar Asian and MENA is equal. all the intersectionality points to the fact that minoritized race women are heavily underrepresented within the industry. And here we go. So male writers, nearly half of the films written by white males in 2020 had cast that were 30% minoritized or less, and 2/3 had cast that were 40% female or less. Women writers and cast diversity, nearly 2/3 of the films written by women in 2020 featured cast that were greater than 30% minoritized, and more than 2/3 had cast that were greater than 40% female. Minoritized race writers, lion's share of films written by people of colour in 2020 featured casts that were over 30% minority, 85.4%, including nearly 2/3 with majority minority cast. So 2/3 of the films written by minoritized race people were led with a majority minoritized race cast. People write what they know. People write their story. If you let them do it, you get this, and it's beautiful, and we love to see it. And again, as I've said earlier, when we get to the box office findings, we'll see why this is hella important. Okay, actually, let me just have a look at so yeah, oh my gosh, yeah, right, I love this. All of the films written by women of minoritized race in 2020 featured casts that were greater than 30% minoritized race, and half had casts that were over 40% female. So, women of a minoritized race writing the top films in 2020, they were the closest to reaching proportionate representation. They're the future. I'm calling it. If you are a minoritized race woman watching this video and you have the amazing idea for a story in your head, even if it is just your story, please write it down. Y'all are our future. Y'all are going to give us these diverse casts. Y'all are going to give us these female leads, or at least, casts that have proportionate representation on female leads, casts that have proportionate representation on minoritized race people. Please pen it. Please do it. Please don't let this show you that you need to be there, that you need to be a part of this room. It's a hard fight for y'all. I get it. But please, if you have the strength to make that fight, please do it. We need you. We need you. All right, I've skipped forward to the bottom line, and I've kind of teased it a lot through here in saying that the reason we need more diversity, or the reason more diversity is going to happen and the more representation is going to happen, is in this bottom line. It's because of the box office and now the household ratings, what they are reflecting. And bear in mind, like, this is all to do with this is America. It's a Hollywood report by UCLA. So this is the America stats. So just also, bear that in mind as we look through. Though 2020 was far from a typical year in the Hollywood film sector, new evidence nonetheless supports long-standing findings from this report series that America's increasingly diverse audiences prefer diverse content. For the smaller than normal number of top films released theatrically in 2020, median global box office receipts peaked for those that had very diverse casts. 41% to 50% minoritized race. For the much larger collection of top films released via streaming platforms, ratings and social media interactions were highest for titles with casts that were from 21% to 30% minoritized race. Meanwhile, minoritized race people accounted for the majority of opening weekend domestic sales for 6 of the top 10 films released in theatres in 2020, ranked by global box office, as well as half of the tickets for a 7th top film. Alright, so here we have the global box office for the theatrical released films, and you can see straight away here that, things peaked for casts that were 41% to 50%. Actually, if I read the little passage here, we'll get a real good look at that. Median global box office peaked for films with casts that were from 41% to 50% minoritized race in 2020. 6 films fell into this diversity interval, including Birds of Prey and Onward. And as I said, they take into account the fact that we did have a pandemic year. So in a year in which theatre attendance was decimated by the COVID-19 pandemic, theatrically released films with relatively diverse casts far outshined their less diverse counterparts at the box office. Indeed, the 12 films with the least diverse casts, that's less than 11% minoritized race, were the poorest performers in 2020. So even though people weren't heading out to the theatres, to the cinema, because obviously they were closed because of the pandemic, when they did, they were going to check out these films. And yeah, look, Birds of Prey onwards, and I'm sure that certainly with the over 50%, Bad Boys for Life fits in there. Like, they were at the beginning of the year before the pandemic took charge. But, you know, it's telling. I don't know. For me, it's still telling. And then here we have the household ratings as well. Now, these are broken down into different demographics. We've got the 18 to 49, white audiences, black audiences, Latinx and Asian. And again, we can see here that for these kind of demographics, the people generally, when it came to households, so watching things from streaming, that it was a 21 to 30% where it was peaking. Although what I kind of also like to look at here is that even though that might have been the case, generally when it came to the diverse audiences here, so with Black, Latinx and Asian, they mainly were looking at watching more diverse films when compared to white audiences as well. I mean, that being said, like, every demographic was still quite high in watching films that were least diverse, that were less than 11%. So, but I think this is where it kind of gets a bit more interesting, where we get to see those top 10 films and see the ones that people were paying out for, especially here in theatrical films. And this is the minority box office share we're looking at. So here we can see percent minority, so how diverse the films were. And here we can see the minority share, so how diverse the audience were. And we can see the highlighting in yellow are those 6 films out of 10 that we mentioned earlier, where minoritized race audiences were going for. And then blue is the 7th equal one, which was Onward. But I mean, look, here you've got Bad Boys for Life. You've got Sonic the Hedgehog, which had a 31 to 40% diverse cast. Birds of Prey, 41 to 50%. Wonder Woman, which of course is led by Gal Gadot, 31 to 40. Croods was the only one that had the lowest bracket of diversity in there. And I think this one's really interesting for the streaming films. So we can see that 8 of the top 10 streaming films and the minority household share. So minoritized households are going to watch these films. If we're talking that 40.3% is the population of minoritized race people in the US, we can see here that they are hitting that proportionate representation for these films or exceeding it in places as well. So that these films are getting an overrepresentation of minoritized race audiences watching them. That's standing for films like Hamilton, Extraction, where they had over 50% minoritized race casts, where they were a majority minoritized race cast. For films like Project Power, which was 41 to 50%. So people are showing up for the more diverse films. And that minoritized households are disproportionately showing up for the more diverse films as well. And now we can break it down further into, so the Asian box office, they were leaning to films, Birds of Prey, Onward, Fantasy Island, Invisible Man. Like, these films are showing here that they're quite heavily diverse, especially Birds of Prey and Onward, which are coming up to 50% minoritized race diverse films. Look at the black box office. The Photograph, Bad Boys for Life are at the top. Monster Hunter, Like a Boss. The top 4 films that black people were checking out in 2020, box office wise, were over 50%. They were a majority minoritized race cast. Latinx as well. Now, as we saw that Latinx people are always heavily underrepresented, there was something we really saw in my video looking at leads and overall cast diversity. If you want to watch that, check that there. But you can see that, you know, they're struggling to find more diverse films that they want to see. But they've watched Come Play, they've watched Fantasy Island, they've watched Bloodshot. Bloodshot was the one with Vin Diesel, right? They've watched Underwater. So it's difficult for them, but they're finding it. And then the white box office share, of course, they're seeing least diverse films because they're going to want to see themselves. And that makes sense. They're going to play to their unconscious bias, as we saw really that black people did as well. So it kind of makes sense. And then the household ratings, and this is where it gets really good. So Asian people at home watching their films: Hamilton, Milan, Onward, Extraction, Over the Moon, Soul. They're showing up. They're showing up. Black people, A Fall from Grace. I don't know that film, but it's got over 50%. It's got, again, a majority minoritized race cast. They're showing up for Project Power, Fatal Affair, The Old Guard. Loved that film. Coffee and Kareem, Extraction. Again, if you give people themselves on screen, they will watch it. This is where they'll spend their money. This is where they will sit down and stream. Latinx, Onward, Milan, Project Power, The Old Guard, Extraction, White Households streaming. They went for Onward. They went for Hamilton. They went for Christmas Chronicles. They went for Extraction, Enola Holmes, The Old Guard. So even sitting at home, they were watching the more diverse films as well. When it went to theatrical releases, going to the cinema, they were least diverse, but sitting at home, they were watching the more diverse films. And I wonder if that is because of it being the pandemic, because they're at home, they're thinking, I'm going to try something new, something that I wouldn't necessarily go to the cinema for. And I'm going to watch this. And they were showing up for it as well. And I'm not surprised Hamilton was massive last year. Yeah, I'm not going to kind of lead you through their conclusion. I've read it. So, if you want to read it, please obviously do. As I say, the link is in the description box. But their conclusion on it is that they obviously question as to how much the pandemic has played a part in this. Because we've been at home and we've been watching films at home on streaming services, what they're questioning is, how has that influenced the films that have been available to us and that we've been able to watch? The fact that we've been at home and the fact that more content is available to us doesn't mean that we have sought out and found these more diverse films that we have then watched them. Does it show that these diverse films may not have done as well in a theatrical release? UCLA, the social sciences, when they do this report, they focus only on theatrical releases. It's only for 2020 that they focused on streaming as well. And would the films that showed up in streaming that have made an indent and made a difference and shown up here in this report, would they have shown up in theatrical release? Considering, when you consider a lot of the films that didn't come out, Black Widow, No Time to Die, and I'm sure there are others. They're just the ones that come off the top of my head. But you know what I mean, right? There were so many films that got pushed back that never came out. And there were so many films that, because we sat at home, we watched, where maybe we wouldn't have watched in an ideal world. So how much has the pandemic affected diversity and representation of 2020 in the Hollywood landscape? The only way we're going to find out is in 2022 when we're checking the report for 2021. Maybe the only way we're going to find out is in 2023 when we're checking the 2022 stats, because that's when we hopefully will be at more of a normal life again. So yeah, it's kind of really interesting. Either way, when it comes to in front of the camera, Hollywood grew massively in diversity, and we are so close to hitting that proportionate representation for both women and minoritized race people. So that's beautiful to see. Behind the camera, there's still an incredible amount of work. Things have doubled or five-folded in a decade, and they still need to double before they reach that proportionate representation. It's taken a decade to get to where they are now. How long will it take to go further? I'm hoping at least not as long, because the world is so much more conscious, and Hollywood says that it's so much more conscious. So hopefully that is the case. But thank you very much for checking out this video. As I said, if you want to check out the first video in which I'm checking out the diversity of lead actors and the overall cast diversity, make sure you click here. If you'd like to find some ways of how to improve diversity and representation and why that is important, then click that playlist right there, and make sure you subscribe, turning on the bell notification. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this in the comments, so make sure you drop a comment in the comment section down below. Until next time, Hakuna MaChatter.